A very good evening and a warm welcome to one and all. While the pandemic made it difficult for all of us to conduct academic activities under a roof, it opened another avenue to connect with scholars and academicians around the globe via online platforms. We at Gokhale Memorial Girls College had started our journey into online activities via webinars since 2020. And with immense pleasure, we would like to tell you all that Department of English, Gokhale Memorial Girls College, under the guidance of our principal madam, Dr. Otoshi Karfa, is conducting this lecture today as a part of a year-long lecture series entitled An Evening with an Expert on topics related to humanities and social sciences. We intend to venture into the emerging fields of humanities and social sciences research through this lecture series, inviting experts and scholars from various disciplines. And without further ado, I would like to ask our patron of this program and our principal madam, Dr. Otoshi Karfa, to deliver the welcome address.
Good evening, everybody. On behalf of the Department of English, Gokhale Memorial Girls College, Kolkata, as well as the entire college community, I welcome this evening's eminent speaker, Professor Amrit Sen, Department of English, Visva-Bharati, Santiniketan, our fellow academicians, our students, and last but not least, our viewers to the inaugural session of this year-long online lecture series. I also congratulate all the members of the Department of English of my college for undertaking such a necessary and yet immensely difficult enterprise, the prime beneficiary of which I believe will be my students. If we have learned anything in the last 2 years, it is that the teaching-learning process in the post-pandemic world can no longer wholly rely on face-to-face interactions between the teacher and the students in the confined spaces of our classrooms. We must eventually learn to adopt an alternative academic environment where virtual modes of teaching and learning coexist, hopefully in a healthy balance with their more traditional counterparts. While there are still people among us who are skeptical, surely for valid reasons, of the sustainability and long-term value of various online academic activities, we cannot deny the urgent need for a way to integrate the virtual world seamlessly and effectively with the concrete walls of our classrooms. I genuinely hope that a collective endeavor, this online lecture series proves to be the very first step towards the desired solution. I once again thank Professor Sen for graciously accepting the invitation to speak in today's lecture, and I have a word of gratitude for all the eminent speakers who will no doubt enrich us with their knowledge on many such evenings in the coming days and months for this year-long lecture series.
I guess there is a connectivity problem. So what should we do now?
Can we just inform her that
I guess
the screen...
connectivity problem. The screen was frozen.
Let the person carry on. Durba Mukherjee ma'am carry on that.
Snehati, তুমি একটু করে দাও, লিংক করে দাও।
Yes, before we proceed, I would like to tell all our viewers today, all the students and everyone who's present today, that you can post your comments after the lecture in the YouTube comment section. The live comments, your questions from the comment section will be taken up with the speaker. And now I would like to ask Professor Durga Mukherjee to introduce our speaker today.
Thank you, Sneha. It is indeed an honor to introduce you. Amrit Sen is presently a professor in the Department of English at Visva-Bharati, Santiniketan. Interested in 18th century studies, travel writing, Tagore studies, and the history of science, he has won the Outstanding Research Award for his doctoral dissertation, The Narcissistic Mode, Metafiction as a Strategy, in Moll Flanders, Tom Jones, and Tristram Shandy, published in 2007. Some of his major publications and edited volumes include Gitanjali, the Centenary Edition 2012, Rabindranath Tagore, The Unsung Hero, Visva-Bharati 2013, Rabindranath Tagore and His Circle, Visva-Bharati 2015, Sharing the Dream, The Remarkable Women of Santiniketan, Visva-Bharati 2016, Confluence of Minds, the Rabindranath Tagore and Patrick Geddes Reader, Education and the Environment, co-edited with Taupati Mukhopadhyay, and Bashopi Fraser, Luo Press, Scotland 2017, The Scottish Enlightenment and the Bengal Renaissance, The Continuum of Ideas, co-edited with Taupati Mukhopadhyay and Bashopi Fraser, Luo Press, Scotland 2017, and Santiniketan for Visitors, Visva-Bharati 2017. And the Bengali chemist Acharya Prafullo Chandra Roy and Postcoloniality, Karikot 2017, and Boshundhara, Rabindranath Tagore and the Environment. He is a joint coordinator of the UGC UKIERI project on the Scotland India Continuum Tagore and His Circle, and the deputy coordinator of the UGC SAP project on Rabindranath Tagore, the East-West Confluence at the Department of English. Apart from his academic engagements, he has also translated and performed in Tagore's dance dramas at national and international programs. He is presently also the joint editor of the Visva-Bharati Quarterly. Among his major awards, he has won the Outstanding Thesis Award by the Government of India, the Research Award by the UGC, the Oxford 18th Century Bursary, and a host of academic recognitions. He has traveled extensively as project coordinator for the UKIERI Award to Edinburgh, Scotland, as invited speaker to the University of Oxford and Twickenham, Tongji University, Shanghai, China. He has also delivered the Tagore Memorial Lecture at the Rabindranath Tagore Center under the Mahatma Gandhi Institute at Mauritius. Professor Amrit Sen has been officiating as the director of Visva-Bharati Granthon Vibhag since July 2018. Over to you, sir.
Right. Very good evening to all of you listening across various parts of the state and beyond, maybe. My sincere regards to Dr. Atushi Korpha, who the principal of this college, for inviting me and delivering a very short yet interesting address where she talked about the blending of the new modes of teaching academics with the older issues. Thank you, the members of the college. I can now justifiably say probably that I am an honorary member of the Department of English, this being, I don't know how many lectures I've delivered here, but it's always a pleasure and great privilege. Also, when Shubham was talking to me about the lecture series, I felt that it was, and it should be, a way in which young students should be alerted to the newer developments in the academic sphere in which they are traveling, so that they are sensitized and alerted to the newer authors coming up, the newer trends in literary criticism. So this is a very ambitious and a very laudatory kind of a project. And I hope that the college has the enthusiasm and the energy to keep it up. However, with a very dedicated group of teachers, I'm sure that this will succeed. Now, I am also privileged that I'm delivering the first lecture in this series. And I'd like to share my ideas with one author who's won the Nobel Prize this year, and along with it, probably share with you a certain engagement with issues that are extremely relevant to our times, especially the issue of migration, refugee, identity, home, and memory. These are some of the issues that urgently confront us as we step into 2022. But I would like to address this issue through, of course, the fiction of Abdulrazak Gurnah. Gurnah won the Nobel Prize last year. This year, I wouldn't say. But I would like to also introduce the students to some of the issues that Gurnah posits and see them in contrapuntality to some of the issues posed by the other writers operating in the same kind of fiction, as it were. Therefore, I've titled this The Gulf Between, just give me a minute, please. I hope the PowerPoint is visible, Shubham.
Yes, sir.
Right. The Gulf Between Cultures and Continents, the fiction of Abdulrazak Gurnah. Now, with Gurnah, of course, comes in the question of a literature of the Indian Ocean. And when I'm talking about the Gulf Between Continents, I am actually talking about the ways in which the Indian Ocean has generated a certain degree of movement and a certain kind of literature. Now, therefore, my first slide begins with a map of the Indian Ocean. And if you locate here is where, Gurnah is based in. He's based in Tanzania. This is the Tanzanian islands, and you have Zanzibar, the group of islands very close to Tanzania. And you have Tanzania being, the union of the Tanganyika and the Zanzibar Islands. You have here India, you have China here, you have Yemen, Oman, and you have Fiji, Indonesia. So what the Indian Ocean meant is from the 6th century onwards, there were continuous sea voyages across the continents through the Indian Ocean. So that, you see, there is a continuous movement of traffic, human beings, goods, various kinds of trading commodities, driven on by, of course, the Indian Ocean winds. And therefore, there is a certain degree of cultural interaction and confluence that happens even much, much before the colonial imperial dominion is trying to sort of assert itself. Now, this is very interesting because at the same time, different kinds of ethnicities, nationalities, continents are coming into close contact. The Africans, the Bantus of Tanzania. Of course, you have the Arabs coming in from Yemen, Oman, even Egypt. You have also the Chinese coming in. You have the East Asians coming in. You have a very significant amount of Indian travelers, especially from the western coast of India, traveling, intermixing, marrying within themselves. And therefore, the Zanzibar in which Abdulrazak Gurnah is born in 1948 is a society that is multicultural, and where these imperial network has then entered and significantly significantly altered it. So you have a state of Zanzibar where you have an erstwhile current of Indian Ocean universalism, cosmopolitanism, followed by an European colonial dominion. And you also have fundamentally three kinds of people living together: the indigenous African people, the Arabs who have arrived here from a long time and have become Africans in that sort of sense, and the Indians who've arrived here and through successive generations become part and parcel of the Tanzanian state. So this is the kind of continuous flux and movement that the Indian Ocean sees. And you can see that one of the very interesting things that I was reading today is that people like Gandhiji, their identities, nationalisms are formed in the Indian Ocean itself. His ideas of nationalism, you remember, are formed primarily working within South Africa. Therefore, this entire region provides a kind of a cauldron of ideas, transport, and fascinating interactions of cultures. I have just put that in a little bit of a critical terminology. Therefore, we are looking at a kind of an Indian Ocean poetics based on Sugata Bose's notion of circulation, where the Indian Ocean is a region constantly in circulation and flux. Now, very often we could tend to think that cosmopolitanism as a philosophy is Western, but we have a cosmopolitanism that dates back to the Indian Ocean, really, much before the West, and therefore we are looking at that kind of an earlier cosmopolitanism, and we're looking at also the nationalisms in Africa, and thereafter with the Mau Mau Revolution and the Zanzibar Revolution, when the indigenous Africans rise in great numbers against the Indians and the Arabs and butcher them, engage in a kind of a genocide. These people are again dispersed primarily to Europe, and therefore begins another wave of cosmopolitanism where they are essentially refugees who are fleeing their homeland. Therefore, these are groups of people, I would say, who are never stable, who are continuously forced on the move, culturally, physically, and socially. And therefore, they are positioned between two homes, sometimes even dual forms of citizenship, right? And it is in these choices and complex relationships that a new kind of cosmopolitanism is forged. Now, also interesting is another critical category that many students are familiar with. If Europe is the global north, then Africa, India, and the Indian Ocean as such is very much part of Middle East, is very much part of a global south. And the global south had its very visible range of lateral networks. And therefore, when we're taking this particular zone, we are moving beyond the categories, the critical categories of the global north on the one hand, and also we can move across the much narrower categories of the nation state and of area studies, right? Therefore, the Indian Ocean emerges in this kind of a way as a method of looking at these issues of displacement, cosmopolitanisms, networks, travels, migrations, and so on and so forth. Now, of course, you might remember, these are some of the critics, Ravinder, Frost, Harper, who talk about a kind of a colonial public sphere rooted in the port cities of Indian Ocean. And therefore, these entrepots like Bombay, Madras, Calcutta, Rangoon, Singapore witnessed a non-European, Western-educated professional class that serviced the requirements of the expanding international commercial interests. Now, those of you who remember that Hindi song, Mere Piya Gaye Rangoon, Wahan Se Kiye Hai Telephone, it's a very interesting song, by the way, in the sense that this working sort of modern Indian has traveled to Rangoon as part of a job involving the colonial machinery, and therefore has established these kinds of settlements of Indians there, as it were. You have it in Fiji as well. And therefore, you have a kind of continuous movements of social, political, religious reforms, ideas, very often, cultural forms like furniture in Africa. We could show you how, I don't have the time, how the furniture of Africa is redesigned through the ways in which Indian furniture has been designed. And therefore, this kind of print culture also emerges when these texts, and again, the example would be Gandhiji's text, should not merely be seen in terms of one kind of Indian nationalism, but a kind of nationalism, print culture that spans across this entire region. And you will have to remember that at one point of time, before Europe has dominated or established its definite domination, there are competing ideas of universalism with the Western one. For example, the Hadramis from Yemen, Sayyids, whose grand religious ambitions tangle with the hubris of European imperial formations. And therefore, the Indian Ocean emerges as this kind of zone of universalism, leading to questions about home, identity, and travel. Now, having said that, I will just spend a few minutes alerting students to the ideas of Edward Said on exile. Exile talks about the purifying, audacious, elemental move of exile, compelling to think about, terrible to experience. Yet exile is so central to many forms of literature across the global West. For example, Steiner talks about many of these texts of great texts of European civilization, including Homer's, as extraterritorial. But what does exile do? To understand the psychology, it creates an unhealable rift between the human being and native place, between the self and the true home, leading to an essential trauma and sadness that cannot really, that can ever be conquered, as it were. And therefore, this crippling sorrow of estrangement, this sense of hauntedness of exile is something that Said sort of alerts us to. Always there's this sense of having left something behind. Now let us come to Gurnah, of course, the author whom we are talking about. Now, if you look at Gurnah is born in 1948. 1963, Zanzibar gains independence. You have the Zanzibar Revolution, where the local Africans protest against the Arab government, and led by Karume, they rise against the Arab government. You see, at this point of time, the local Africans, or let us talk about the Africans as colored people, are up in arms against the hegemony of what they see as the Arabs who are in government and the Indians who are in control over the trade, right? And therefore they rise in terrible rebellion, killing almost 20,000 Arabs and Indians, raping women, and many of these affluent, or many of the Arabs who could, they depart from Zanzibar in exile in 1964 onwards. 1968, you see, as part of that, Gurnah emigrates to Britain, right? And therefore, Zanzibar becomes that originary home, which sort of haunts Gurnah. He is, you see, exactly 20 years old at the time when he's leaving Zanzibar. So he's sort of spent his childhood, his young adulthood, and therefore at a very impressionable age, where Zanzibar remains the core, the center of all his fictions, and his sense of exile into Britain. And when Gurnah is growing to Britain, Britain is gripped by this kind of a influx of people from its erstwhile colonies. With the Mau Revolution, also in Africa, a large number of Indians have arrived in Britain. You have a large number of Africans coming in now from Tanzania. So there's a degree of racist invective against these arrivals. So you have a group of people who are caught in between. And this in-betweenness, this state of liminality where they're rejected by their homeland and not accepted by the land where they have migrated, that creates a kind of a trauma which becomes the staple of Gurnah's fiction. And let me read through a part of this Gurnah repeatedly talks about. He says, I came from Zanzibar, a small island, which had seen a violent uprising. In the shambles and persecution and the vindictive terror ruled our lives. I escaped. Many others did the same. Some were captured and disappeared. Most got safely away. And he remembers the terrible risks people took to escape. And he says, people take risks because they fear for their lives. Unarguable, terrible thing to be so afraid. And I want to remember that. So memory plays a very important part in Gurnah's fiction, repeatedly revisiting the trauma of the exile, of the violence, and to remind anyone who is inclined to forget, to imagining what it might feel like. And it's interesting that Gurnah, at this point of time, he does not really see himself as an asylum seeker, because he's already part of a British empire, and therefore he's a legitimate subject. He's a legitimate. He has the legitimacy to come over to Britain. He is ashamed of his country, of the brutalities and honors which we had inflicted on ourselves, and therefore he has to bottle this up. This shame about his own country and the way in which he is treated him. And he says, "What a shock it was to discover the loathing in which I was held. Everybody did their bit and thought themselves tolerant." The casual kind of racism that he encountered in British society, the kind of layer and veneer of politeness and tolerance, and you scratch the surface and you have the racist undertone. And he says, I was petrified by that, but I had broken the law in my own country and there was no going back. So what are the questions that Gurnah asks in his fiction? And that is the staple of this paper, really. So when these in-between people move, what do they remember? How does memory function in them? How do they cope with what they remember? You see, coping with memory trauma is one of the most important and essential parts of survival. How do they cope with what they find? Right. So there are two kinds of coping: coping with what is there and what was there, memory, and coping with survival. And indeed, how are they received? So Gurnah then talks about the ways in which, in every single fiction, the ideas of exile and relations are then dissected. Now, it's interesting that Gurnah's treatment in his fiction does not talk about any kind of nostalgic sense of exile. There are characters, of course, but Gurnah's fiction is much more unsentimental. And secondly, he does not have any kind of excitement with the kind of hybridity that exile brings. For him, exile is that definite, terrible thing which must be narrated and which must be, articulated in a fiction that is largely unsentimental. Now, Gurnah is also in this particular group of fictions reacting against this sense of African nationalism, a version of which was issued by Senghor and the others, who talked about Africa's primordial values as precondition for liberation and the collective desire for an ethnic identity. Gurnah rather argues that African identity too is multicultural, multifarious, and therefore in reducing the African identity to a primarily Black identity, parts of the African identity are being erased out. Right. And you, of course, we are reminded of Partha Chatterjee, who talks about the third world nationalisms, which follow the kind of narrower nationalisms of the Western nation states, and therefore create or try to neutralize any form of dissenting voices that exist. This has been a particularly, problematic area for African nationalisms, and have largely led to a degree of crisis which has not yet been resolved in many of the African countries that we tend to look at. Now, this is something which I just would like to just slightly off the topic, but within this mix.
I am really sorry to interrupt over here, but the slides are not moving at all. I just wanted to inform you that.
Oh, the slides are not moving.
No.
They are moving in my particular. Are they visible now?
Yes.
Yes, it's visible now.
This is good. Yeah.
Right. Maybe I'll have to use this kind of a framework. I'm sorry about that. Right.
Could you go full screen with the slides, if possible, sir?
Yeah, I went full screen, but then now is this visible? Are the slides moving now?
Yes. Yes.
Right.
Visible.
Visible. Right. Now, a slight detour here, because many of us would be interested to see what the position of the Indians was during this period of time. And therefore, I would like to sort of bring in one very important author, Indian author now settled in Canada, or rather Canadian author maybe, and that is M.G. Vasanji. And M.G. Vasanji's very famous work, The In-Between History of Vikram Lal, which was published in 2003, talks about this particular kind of, again, in-betweenness of the Indians, who are hated both by the Africans for being closer to the colonialists, and who are despised by the colonialists because they consider them to be an inferior race. So the Indian, as it were, is associated with monetary interests. You see, Vikram Lal is in many ways presented by Vasanji as the most corrupt man in the entire kingdom, as it were. And therefore, they are seen as opportunists. And therefore, this stereotype and this hostility against the Indians in East Africa is, again, something that Vasanji sort of talks about. So anybody of you who is interested in Gurnah might also take a look at the fictions of Vasanji. Right. I will not go into this because this is largely beyond my subject today. But if any of you are interested in taking up the further research on the Indian Ocean literatures, this is probably one author whom you need to take a look at. Now, Gurnah, of course, and let me come back to my topic, talks about the sense of the immigrant literature marked by a sense of rootlessness, right, which is slightly different from the more familiar hybrid, models of Achebe or Rushdie or Walcott. These characters never really belong. If the others are marked by dualities, they are marked by absences, right? So while the others search for identity, here are characters who are primarily marked by a non-identity. And therefore, they're always in a state of flight, never towards a home, really. And therefore, this displacement creates a sense of, a character who is forever in flux real. Now, I've just used Vasanji's fiction so that you can take a look at George's idea of the immigrant genre, which is always between homes, and there is a perennial kind of a fascination with an absence of home and a non-identity that seems to mark their very existence. So what are Gurnah's major themes? Major themes would be the lingering trauma of colonialism, war and displacement. You see, Gurnah makes this very important distinction between the earlier cosmopolitanism, which had created fertile, mergers of identity, settlements, homes, and the European model, which has generated a violent counterculture of displacement and ethnic identities. So Gurnah does not see colonialism as something that ends with nationalisms. He sees nationalisms as an extension of colonialism, which, of course, you can see how relevant Gurnah's ideas are today. Of course, exile, displacement, belonging, colonialism are themes which most of his novels being about people who have been somewhere, inflicted with the trauma of war, displacement, and so on. And you see, there is, and one of the problems of Gurnah's fiction, really, as I sift through his works, is that many of these fictions are repetitive in the sense that they are located in Zanzibar and keep on harping about the same theme, right? And Gurnah himself acknowledges that his homeland always asserts himself in his imagination, even when he deliberately tries to set his stories elsewhere. So this seems to be an obsessed novelist who is revisiting this trauma, this memory, these memories over and over again, and none of his characters really come to terms with their present locations. Right. So completely unflinching and completely passionate and full of heart for the people of East Africa and the alienation and the loneliness that immigration can produce, these become his major themes, especially in his important books, including By the Sea, which I'll briefly discuss along with his most important novel till date, Paradise. Now, before that, Gurnah begins his career with a 1987 book titled Memory of Departure. Now, interestingly, he's writing this book while he's writing his thesis, right? So, and Gurnah went on to become a professor at the University of Kent. So he's well placed. He's while he's doing this thesis, he's also writing this Memory of Departure. And this is about a young man's growth to maturity in the background of the Zanzibar Revolution. Many of his fictions are, in fact, coming-of-age fictions, what we'll call the Bildungsroman. In a certain sense, if you look at the Bildungsroman too is always in a state of flux. It is in the state of becoming rather than having arrived. So for Gurnah, the Bildungsroman becomes a kind of an objective correlative through which this nascent histories of these people from Zanzibar, who are always in the making, become prominent. And Hassan Omar therefore travels to Nairobi, romances his cousin Salma, and finally returns home and departs for Madras. So you see, this multicultural text of Eastern Africa, this movement between territories, is something that he's talking about in his first novel. Gurnah seems to come to his own in the
sorry to interrupt.
Yes.
Slides are not moving again.
I think I would be better off doing this. Is this okay now?
Yes, it's visible now, but it stopped moving in between. Okay.
Okay, let me try and get back. Alert me. No problem.
Yes.
Is this visible? Right.
Yes, it's visible now.
So Pilgrim's Way, this comes in 1988, so almost follows Memories of Departure. And therefore, This is where the black protagonist, Daud, seems to be an alter ego of Gurnah as he works in a hospital orderly in the town of Canterbury, where Gurnah himself lived and worked. And this is a novel where Daud confronts European racism. And therefore, Daud, in a series of letters, he sort of bears his soul about the difficulties he has to face in British society. It's interesting, because Gurnah's first novels do not talk about the trauma of exile. They are rather dealing with the trauma of adjustment and racism. It's only in his second series of books that he seeks to go back to this theme of exile. The third, and this is another fascinating book, is Dotty. Dotty is 1990. And this is the only book till date where Gurnah's fiction centers around a young black girl called Dotty. Dotty, interestingly, is not born in Zanzibar. This is a unique book in that sense because she is British born and she gradually comes to see through the interaction with a mentor how black people are perennially, marginalized in society. So Gurnah's fictions, interestingly, one of the other critiques that has been offered is that they are predominantly gendered and biased in the way of male and patriarchal kind of value systems, where the man and the exile of the man becomes...
Over here, the slides are not replacing one after another again, yet again.
Now?
It is there, but sir, can you please go full screen? Perhaps then it might be easier for you to place. I don't know.
You went full screen, unfortunately. Whenever I go.
The small little thing that is on the bar that's right at the bottom of the screen. One on the right. There are three small little, yes, that's the one.
Right, is this okay now? Right. So it's interesting in the way that Dotty becomes the only fiction of Gurnah which foregrounds the narrative of a young girl, young black girl. And again, the theme, as in the first, or rather, let's put it this way, the two major books of the early Gurnah, they talk about European racism rather than the violence and the memory of Black Africa. Now, the point of departure in Gurnah's career, and I hope that this slide is visible, is Paradise. Now, Paradise remains till date Gurnah's most famous novel. Once again, using the structure of the Bildungsroman, and Gurnah's fiction is, as it were, located in the First World War and the Germans taking control over Zanzibar in the sense. So,
sorry, sir, your Paradise, the slide of Paradise is not visible. It's still stuck in the Dotty one. Yes, now it's visible.
Sir, I would request, sir, there is a situation here. I think you switch it off. I mean, stop the sharing and start again. What is happening is you're sharing the PowerPoint and not the full screen. So I'm sorry with the trouble, but please.
Right, is it visible now?
Yes, sir, it's visible.
I think I'll stick to this and I'll maybe allow myself to read through some of the slides so that, we are not really interrupted, because that then sort of disrupts the entire flow of the lecture.
Yes.
Right. Right. Anyways, so Gurnah is basing this in pre-World War Zanzibar and the arrival of the Germans. But this is a very hard-hitting kind of a text, where you have the character Yusuf, who is at the center of the tale, who is sold to his uncle, the merchant Aziz, to pay off his father's debt. And Yusuf sets across with Aziz to the heartlands of Africa, in this entire network of trade that the Arabs had with the African people. And you have this violent interactions between the Africans and the Arabs and the Indians and the Africans, so that what seems to be a paradise in Zanzibar is bared as a kind of a history of, let us put it this way, conflicting interests between different sects of people. So Gurnah's text is laying bare, as it were, the slave trade, the violence with African tribal society, the complicity of Indians and Arabs, the trade within the trade, African trade, and the irony within the title exposes the realistic and anti-romantic vision of African society with its strife, distrust, and contradictions, ready to explode into violence. So in a certain sense, Paradise remains a touchingly endearing book, where through the prism of the young boy who seeks to locate paradise is recurrently interrupted by the realities which encroach and reveal the tremendous contradictions present within the Zanzibar state. Right, so this is, I would say, that very eminent point of departure from which we see a darker Gurnah concentrating not any longer on Europe, but primarily on Zanzibar. And this brings me to the next few novels, which are all based in trying to create a Zanzibar out of memory. Admiring Silence, this is 1996, where there is an actual return. In fact, Gurnah also returned to Africa and was extremely disillusioned. So this becomes a kind of a surrogate history of Gurnah's own return to Zanzibar and his subsequent movement back to Europe. But the novel which I find fascinating, apart from Paradise, of course, in Gurnah, is By the Sea, because Gurnah is here talking not only about a kind of a homogeneous construction of the immigrant, but he's trying to locate the various shades, conditions from which people have emigrated. And therefore you have two characters here, Omar and Mahmoud, who narrate their intertwined family histories. And very interestingly, both of them are placed in Zanzibar in a state of conflict. The two families are, as it were. And once they arrive in Britain, now they can strike up a friendship which is built on these shared, memories and the shared phenomenon of exile. So Gurnah is talking about exile, but suggesting that exile is never homogeneous across individuals, and each, as it were, individual experiences exile with his own degrees and, let us put it, and intensities of the trauma. So By the Sea remains a very interesting, text where the sea becomes extremely potent. There is the sea in Zanzibar. There's the sea in England, which is the connective. But there's also this, vast, extreme expanse of the sea within which these lives seem to be sucked in, each life existing independently and individually, as well as in terms of a collective. Now, the next novel that I'd like to talk about is The Last Gift. This is 2011, where this ailing African immigrant is sort of rendered immobile by a series of diabetic strokes, and he confesses that he has left behind an African wife and an unborn child 40 years ago, so that his family then travels to try and locate them once again. And there is sense that, no point of time in the career or in the life of the individual is, memory able to be erased. So Gurnah writes, places don't live just where they are, they live within you. So very importantly, the last gift is the gift of, as it were, the memory of the character grafted onto the family, so that Gurnah seems to suggest that these themes of exile, home, non-belonging are handed over from generation to generation. You see, that is where young students must look at the issue of Gurnah's specific kind of writings on exile and the diasporic writings. Because you see, you might be, tempted to think Gurnah only of as the Arab African diaspora in Britain. No, in the diasporic writing, you see, after the first generation of the diaspora or the second generation, it is always the host country which becomes more important. In Gurnah's fiction, on the other hand, the question of birth, home, remains a lingering issue, as it were. But of course, then you might argue again that Gurnah is experiencing both home and exile at the same time. I would just skip a few other novels and come to Gurnah's 2020 novel. And this is Afterlives, where Gurnah now sort of distributes these histories of Zanzibar into 4 protagonists living in the early 20th century in an unnamed part of the Swahili coast. And once again, Gurnah locates this in the history of the German colonial rule and narrates the influence that colonialism can have across generations, creating rift across families, which are carried on from one generation to the other. So this is his latest novel, Afterlives, published 2020. So we've traveled across Gurnah's creative oeuvre, and we locate that we can put this in kind of 3 perspectives. One is the early Gurnah, who talks about arrivals, accommodations, acculturations, survivals, and critiques the racism that he finds in England. Remember that Gurnah has never written in Swahili, his own language. He's always written in English. Is much more of an English writer. So his first point of literary reference to it is to the country where he's sort of settled and the critique of its own racism. From the 4th novel onwards, we see something strange happening. Gurnah going back to his roots, to the memories of exile, to his failure of crossing over those memories and settling in the country, so that a series of novels appear, which then grapple with this conflict between rootedness and rootlessness, between home and exile, belonging and non-belonging, identity and non-identity. In between, you have the novel Paradise, which seems to sort of indicate, the ways in which innocence is lost through the character of Yusuf. And then you have the later Gurnah, where you have series of aged people trying to remember and reconcile themselves with the memories of Zanzibar and failing in the process. So Gurnah's fiction, therefore, is spread across generations, ages, and strategies of individuals trying to cope with this kind of a movement. And therefore, the space of Zanzibar of the 1960s remains this kind of an utopia, which must be visited, sullied, revisited over and over again. Now, Gurnah is also talking about the contradictions, cruelties, and latent violence implicit in these societies. So, now, you see, there are 2 Zanzibars. as it were, in Gurnah. One is the Zanzibar, which is fervently utopian in his imagination. And the other is the Zanzibar, which he revisits and in his fictions and recognizes repeatedly how much that Zanzibar is a fractured, violent state which has been perverted, as it were, by colonialism. And then he talks about an erstwhile Zanzibar, where these multicultural roots lay, where these networks of the Indian Ocean could function, and where there was a past which was much more accommodative. Now, his characters almost always arrive in Britain in a state of panic and confusion, are met with racism and hostility, and perpetually located in a world of shadows where the past intrudes onto an uncomfortable reality. Right. Therefore, this is again something that leads us onto why should we read Gurnah? That's a question which one needs to ask. Incidentally, I might alert students to the fact that very few people actually read Gurnah before he won the Nobel Prize, and his publishers were suddenly inundated with requests of sort of reprinting his books. Gurnah, I will personally confess that I knew Gurnah's name not as a great novelist, but as the editor of the Cambridge Companion to Salman Rushdie. Right, he was much better known as an academic, as it were. But Gurnah becomes very crucial, you see, because of the urgent crisis of the immigrant and the refugee, which is sweeping across Europe and also India. Because in many ways, not only are fractured nationhoods questions of ethnic violence leading refugees to port cities, migration due to the climate is also another very major category, which, for example, Amitav Ghosh talks about in Gun Island recently, and the way in which people displaced from the Sundarbans are traveling all across the globe in search of a living. You see, why do these refugees travel? How are they displaced? What is the history of this violence? What is the history of this, uprootedness? When does one leave home until, there is a terrible duress? And how do they cope? Gurnah then talks about this in a Guardian interview. And Gurnah, this is something which I find extremely potent. He says the debate over asylum is twinned with a paranoid narrative of race, disguised and smuggled in as euphemisms about foreign lands and cultural integrity. So this is the discourse in much of Europe at this point of time, also across, also across the Indian subcontinent, where you have the issue of the Rohingya crisis, for example, looming large over even our own country. So this question about race, about foreign lands and cultural integrity is an urgent question that one needs to confront. And Gurnah alerts us to the fact that there is a rational and humane way to conduct this debate. And this better way requires knowledge and humanity, not glib and diminishing cliches, right? So every one of these refugees, as it were, as they move across various territories, carries with them a story. And Gurnah unpacks these stories and unpacks the pain, the horror, the memory of these stories so that they remain alive to the critical consciousness of the people. Now, finally, of course, and this is where my title comes from, I just like to refer to the Nobel Prize for Literature, which was awarded to him in 2021 for his uncompromising and compassionate penetration of the effects of colonialism and the fates of the refugee in the gulf between cultures and continents. I had started with the premise of the Indian Ocean and the migration of people as something which was, one can say, positive and enabling a true multiculturalism, the evolution of societies that were throbbing with interactions between different cultures. What Gurnah suggests is that subsequent experiences of colonialism have created monstrous nation states and ethnic conflicts that then push out people in the name of genocide to threaten their lives so that they are forced to move into exile between cultures and continents. And in this movement and this perpetual lack of settlement, where they cannot go back, where they are not welcome, they remain like Vasanji's Vikram Lal in a permanent state of in-betweenness in the gulf between cultures and continents. It is therefore that we see Gurnah as a writer of our times, and it is therefore that I would request any of you to take a look at his fictions. Thank you once again for inviting me today. And despite the technical glitches, I hope I have been able to alert younger minds to some of the nuances of Gurnah's fiction. Thank you, and I would be very eager for your comments and your questions.
Thank you so much, sir, for your brilliant lecture. And as you have quite pertinently pointed out, the perspective that Gurnah adopts to the narration of Zanzibar as a space, and it's a multitudinous space that you have talked about. So we have few questions on our YouTube. And the first question is from Professor Pinaki Roy. And he asked that Gurnah's migration is both forced and voluntary. So is it a bit troubling that he would be obsessed with bringing Tanzania in this context? Is it not, respected sir? Should I read it again? About Gurnah's
I lost the last part of the question. I lost the...
Gurnah's migration is both forced and voluntary. So is it a bit troubling?
Could you just repeat the question?
Obsessed with bringing Tanzania in this context? Is it not, respected sir?
Is it not?
Is both forced and voluntary. So is it a bit troubling that he would be obsessed with bringing Tanzania in this context? Is it not, respected sir?
No, you see, you can say that Gurnah has the luxury of exile at this point of time, and is therefore it's a kind of a voluntary exile. Remember, he's only 20 at this point of time when he's coming over. But one must remember that, you know, for many of the people who migrated, and Gurnah is talking about the individual and the collective again, exile was the only viable option. You think about the Gujaratis who sort of migrated, most of them killed by the or family members killed during the Mau Revolution. You have, for example, the Zanzibar Revolution, where you were actually looking at genocide. So, you know, Gurnah was aware that had he stayed on in Zanzibar, he would always have had the threat to his life and also been a second-class citizen. Therefore, in that sense, you know, home in Zanzibar was never really an option for Gurnah. And you can see in, for example, that's why I say, you know, By the Sea is such a fascinating novel. You know, the ways in which gradually most of these Arabs are being pushed out of Zanzibar into exile at different places in time in different ways, but in a certain way, exile becomes almost inevitable for these people, right? But then again, yes, of course, one of the things that Pinaki is absolutely right in pointing out is that Gurnah had a degree of agency in the sense that he was a subject empire still, and therefore he had a valid reason to migrate to, not only a reason, but also a kind of a legal authority to migrate into Britain. Now, when he talks about the people who are coming in recent times, he is alert to the fact that they come in as almost stateless and citizenless. But he points to the fact that at one point of time, he did go through a similar kind of an experience.
Thank you, sir. An additional question from Professor Pinaki Roy. How much is Islam important as a theme in his novels? How much is Islam important as a theme in his novels?
Well, you see, Pinaki, I am, that is a question which is very provocative in this way. You know, Gurnah is using a lot of Arab words, using a lot of phrases, ways of life of an Islamic culture. But per se, if you ask me, Islam as a religion never really figures that much in Gurnah's fictions, right? I do not really think that he is really talking about it. And even if he's doing it, take a novel like Paradise, for example, where the Indian is mercilessly, kind of bantering the Arab troop about their religion and their religious practices. Remember, he wants to write a Quran. He wants to translate the Quran himself, which the Arabs find blasphemous. But so religion as such, I don't think is very phenomenally important in Gurnah's fiction, Islam as a religion, as it were. But the Islamic culture, with its kind of hospitalities, with its kind of cultural ways of behavior, patterns of sets, patterns of belief, family, for example, these are crucial elements in Gurnah's fiction. So I don't know which exact question you're moving towards, Islam as such or the Islamic culture. I'll not also call this Islamic, but in the East African universe, Gurnah points out where there are crossovers, as it were, between Islamic cultures, Indian cultures, African cultures. So Gurnah would rather talk about a kind of a Swahili culture, as it were, which existed in his own home, right? I wouldn't say that Gurnah is very determined about his Islamic identity in any sense of the term. No.
Thank you, sir. Another question. How do you locate the privilege of writing in English and exposure to the first world benefits as a professor of Kent University in his narration of migrant trauma?
Right. That is a question which is the icing on the cake. That is, who's asked that, by the way? That's a really good question.
It's my question, actually.
Oh, it's your question. Right. So you are claiming anonymity, right? Hiding behind the veil in the way Gurnah writes. But you see, the point is, again, Gurnah is aware that writing about his theme of exile and his in-betweenness is possible only in the English language, probably, because his predominant readership is never going to be the Zanzibari people. It is going to be the people who have been exiled along with him. And also Gurnah's training as a professor in literature and his alertness to post-colonial theory makes him, in many ways, a kind of a critical writer, as it were. You see, because his first novel is being written as his thesis is being written. And therefore, this question about what is African literature and how can one write about these memories, exiles, is something which is very critical to him. He, for example, he never translates the Swahili word, so he tries to keep an element of indigeneity. But then again, he's alert that these notions, these romantic notions of exile, are, as it were, available. And remember that not only is exile important, but also settlement in Britain. So he's also critiquing and alerting the British to the casual racism that they inflict upon the refugee, as it were. So in that sense, English becomes the way in which he can address his target audience.
Thank you so much. By Iram Irfan. Good evening, sir. Your lecture looks at Gurnah's novels from the point of view of immigration. What would change if we look at his novels from the point of view of emigration? Immigration and emigration.
Well, if you look at it from the point of immigration, really, then you would find a kind of a Gurnah who is alerting the African nation about the nightmares of how they have coped with the colonial situation. You know, in many ways, as Rushdie would have alerted us to the disillusionment of with the nation state in Midnight's Children. You know, Gurnah's fiction read by an African audience would then predominantly talk about the kind of past, the kind of cohesive past that existed, the kind of violence that colonialism inflicted, the kind of dream that an African nationalism generated, and the disillusionment and the ethnic conflicts that nationalism produced. So, you know, when Partho Chatterjee talks about the disillusionment with third world nationalisms where the familiar structures of colonialism are used, Gurnah's fictions about Africa seen from an emigrant's perspective would alert them to these to the ways in which the nation state has failed its multicultural past.
Thank you so much, sir. Shinjini, do you have any more questions in the chat box? In the YouTube chat box?
No, Shubham, nothing as of yet, other than whatever I have posted.
So may I request Professor Rajkumar Bodman to kindly deliver the vote of thanks?
Yes, certainly, Shubham.
Okay, thank you. Thank you so much, sir.
But then, Shubham, there's a post from Professor Pinaki Roy. Should I read it out or should I forward it to you?
Yes, please forward it to me.
Okay. Okay.
So do we have any other questions, Shubham? If no, I can proceed.
No, just a minute. So there is a comment from Professor Pinaki Roy, and he has responded to your comment, sir. He is writing back, we remember what Ashcroft, Griffiths, and Tiffin had to say regarding the untranslated words. So this is just the post-colonial reversal. He has just written a rejoinder to your comment in the chat box. Okay.
Thank you, Pinaki.
Yes. And Rajkumar Da, so we can go ahead with the vote of thanks now. So please go ahead. Thank you.
Okay. Respected Principal Ma'am, Honorable Speaker, my beloved colleagues and esteemed viewers of the program, I feel honored to have been asked to propose the vote of thanks to all who are associated with this program. Introducing Abdulrazak Gurnah with specific reference to his works and critically engaging readers to his writing with such illuminating and insightful thoughts is a pioneering attempt. And Dr. Sen has been able to do that very successfully, and his valuable speech will certainly encourage thousands of scholars as well as students across the nation and abroad to read and work on Gurnah. I therefore, on behalf of the college and on behalf of the Department of English, convey my sincere thanks and gratitude to Dr. Amrit Sen for speaking on the Nobel laureate Gurnah in spite of his busy schedule. Secondly, I thank our respected principal ma'am, Dr. Otoshi Karfa, for giving us the necessary permission and continuously supporting the department in order to organize this lecture series. I must thank our viewers for watching and listening and raising some valuable questions to enrich the program. I take this opportunity to thank all my beloved colleagues for their constant support and enthusiasm in order to make this event a success. Finally, I want to thank Mr. Akash Mondal for the necessary technical support in order to make the program a big success.
Thank you, Rajkumar Da. And before we officially end the program, it's the time for a group photo. So may I request every one of you to switch on your camera, and we will have a group photo with sir, and we will preserve it as an archival document. Okay. So Akash Babu, kindly proceed with the.
Yes, please just give me a minute. Thank you. It's done. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Thank you.
Thank you once again, sir.
Thank you, sir. And thank you, everyone. Thank you,
Okay.
Akash Babu.
Thank you and good night to everybody.
Yes.
Thank you, sir.